Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of history's oldest and honestly most intense family dramas. We're going to focus on Isaac, Jacob, and the origins of a sacred legacy that, shockingly enough, is built on a foundation of absolute deception. We're looking at a story totally fraught with tension, deep family conflict, and real pain. It's a narrative that proves human frailty is often right there, front and center, in the most monumental historical events. So, let's dive right into this by asking a pretty tough question. How exactly did human frailty, blatant favoritism, and stolen blessings somehow shape the foundation of an entire nation? Because when you look at the raw source material, let me tell you, this is definitely no sanitized fairy tale. It actually looks a lot more like a modern reality TV show. It's a messy, complex web of free moral agents making deeply flawed choices. Let's start by looking at the man caught right in the middle of it all. Here we have the patriarchal hinge. To really get this story, you have to look at Isaac. He is the crucial hinge holding this massive narrative together. On one side, you have his father, Abraham, the one who received the original divine promises. And then on the other side, you have the incredibly messy reality of the next generation, led by his son Jacob. And to understand the tension of that next generation, we have to look at the woman Isaac married, 250. Think about that number for a second. That represents the 250 gallons of water that Isaac's future wife, Rebekah, drew for 10 camels when Abraham's servant first met her. Now, a thirsty camel can drink up to 25 gallons of water in one fell swoop. So for her to water 10 of them, that means she is going back and forth hauling an immense amount of water. This little detail proves early on that she was a woman of incredible energy, drive, and action. She was a mother who would fiercely and actively orchestrate her family's fate. Eventually, Isaac and Rebekah have twin boys. But man, even their birth is a literal battleground. The twins are born actually fighting, with the younger one grasping his older brother's heel. Talk about sibling rivalry starting early, right? Because of this, he earns the name Jacob, or Yaakov in Hebrew. This is a name that literally means to grasp, to grab, or even to deceive. And wow, does that ever perfectly set up his entire character arc. His life will be completely defined by a pattern of grasping for things that just aren't naturally his.
Which brings us to the core conflict, birthright versus blessing.
This fierce rivalry between these two twins is the absolute heart of our family drama. First, you have Esau, the older brother, who grew up to be a rugged, skillful hunter, a real man of the open country. And then you have Jacob. The text calls him a quiet man, implying he's a guy who stays among the tents. But here's the catch. Before these boys were even born, Rebekah felt them jostling within her and sought a divine answer. What she got was a foundational prophecy declaring the older will serve the younger. This was a massive subversion of ancient cultural norms, and it became the main driver for the entire plot. Given how close Isaac and Rebekah were, it's highly likely both parents were entirely aware of this prophecy. Yet a tragic dynamic of favoritism took root anyway. Isaac favored the rugged Esau, and Rebekah favored the quiet Jacob. The tension totally peaks in what seems like a completely mundane moment. An exhausted Esau comes in from the open country, absolutely famished, and begs Jacob for some of the lentil stew he's cooking. Specifically, the original Hebrew translates to him asking for that red. Jacob, always the grasper, immediately sees an opportunity. He demands Esau sell him his birthright in exchange for the meal, and Esau famously agrees. It is a devastating permanent trade over a simple bowl of soup. It's a brutal historical reminder of what happens when we trade our long-term legacy for short-term, immediate gratification. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand exactly what Esau gave away and what Jacob stole, because they are two entirely different things. The birthright meant a double inheritance of the father's wealth and crucial leadership over the extended family and clan. I mean, it was a wildly expensive and powerful position. The blessing, on the other hand, held prophetic significance, divine favor, and actually dictated future rule over brothers. So Jacob essentially bought the earthly wealth with a bowl of stew, but that incredible prophetic destiny, well, that was still up for grabs.
And that sets the stage for the ultimate deception.
As Isaac grows old and blind, this family completely fractures over who gets that final, irreversible blessing. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the deeply flawed choices made by free moral agents. Isaac, seemingly completely ignoring the prophecy he already knew about, secretly plans to give the supreme blessing to his favorite, Esau. Rebekah overhears this and leaps into action, orchestrating outright fraud. She cooks a meal and literally covers Jacob in animal skins so he feels hairy, just like his brother. Jacob, even though he's initially a bit wary, goes along with it and boldly lies right to his blind father's face.
The crazy thing is, the ruse actually works. Believing he's talking to Esau, Isaac delivers this staggering prophetic blessing: "May nations serve you, be lord over your brothers." He effectively attempts to crown Esau, completely countering the prophecy that the older would serve the younger. But because he was tricked, the immense power and dominance of that blessing fall entirely onto Jacob instead. When Esau finally returns and the truth comes out, Isaac trembles violently. Esau is left with what's basically an anti-blessing, promising him a hard life of servitude and the sword.
As you can guess, Esau is furious and literally plans to murder his brother. Rebekah catches wind of this and tells Jacob he has to run. But the tragic irony here is that despite securing the birthright and the blessing in name, it is a completely hollow victory. A terrified Jacob has to flee for his life as a fugitive, entirely empty-handed. He has no double inheritance, he has no clan leadership, and heartbreakingly, these circumstances fracture the family so deeply that he will never actually see his mother, Rebekah, again. So, the deceiver gets deceived.
Jacob runs north to his mother's homeland, but if he thought he was the ultimate trickster, well, karma is about to catch up with him big time. He meets his absolute match in his uncle Laban. Laban is a monumental schemer who gives Jacob a harsh, decades-long taste of his own medicine. After Jacob works 7 full years to marry the woman he loves, Rachel, Laban famously swaps her out for her older sister, Leah, right on the wedding night under the cover of darkness. Over 20 long years, Laban changes Jacob's wages 10 different times, utilizes divination, and constantly attempts to manipulate their agreements to steal the best of the flocks. It's just a relentless cycle of deceit.
Yet, amazingly, a greater plan is still working through this incredibly frail, fallen situation. Out of this super messy, tension-filled exile, and out of the intense rivalry between Jacob's wives, a massive family has built. From Leah, Rachel, and their handmaids, 12 sons are born. And these aren't just any children. They form the complex origins of the 12 tribes of Israel. Key figures emerge right here, like Judah, from whose line kings will eventually come, and Joseph, who will ultimately receive those highly coveted firstborn rights. This leads us to a pivotal moment: wrestling with God. After 2 decades of servitude, Jacob finally escapes Laban, only to face his absolute worst nightmare, confronting Esau, the brother who literally swore to kill him. The night before they meet, Jacob is terrified. He divides his enormous entourage, his wives, and his children, sending them all across the river Jabbok. Jacob is left completely alone in the dark. And it's here, in the dead of night, that a man appears, setting the stage for a literal, violent wrestling match that lasts until daybreak. This scene is so incredibly evocative, it has inspired countless artists, including Rembrandt, to capture the sheer physical and spiritual struggle of this exact moment. In this climax at a place called Peniel, which translates to the face of God, Jacob wrestles with this divine messenger. Realizing he cannot overpower Jacob, the messenger touches Jacob's hip socket, wrenching it permanently. But Jacob, ever the one to grab and hold on, refuses to let go until he receives a blessing. Right here, his entire identity is fundamentally changed. His name is no longer Jacob, the deceiver. It becomes Israel, meaning he struggles with God. The text actually tells him this is because he has struggled with God and with humans and has overcome. The deceiver finally receives his blessing, not by tricking an old blind man, but through a direct, painful struggle with the divine. And so we are left to wonder, how is it that a story so fraught with human failing, broken families, and stolen destinies somehow became the enduring foundation of a massive historical transformation? It brilliantly illustrates that even through the darkest webs of our own making, a greater narrative can still be woven. So what does it say about human history, and maybe even our own lives, that our greatest legacies are so often forged not in perfection, but in the struggle itself?